Well, the same school had this idea that when you were 14, art didn't exist as a real subject anymore. There was no art class after the age of 14. But I was fortunate. I was a stubborn, awkward, cantankerous and precocious little sod, and I insisted that that didn't mean art didn't exist just because it wasn't in their curriculum. So to shut me up, they gave me a key to the art department, basically. And I had a free reign in my own time. Instead of having a lunch break or after school, I could go in the art department. And the two teachers were really nice, and they would show me how to do silkscreen and show me all these things that they didn't teach the younger kids. They'd show me all the stuff that they were excited by when they were still at college. So I had basically two private tutors who were really just so glad to have one person really interested, you know. And they wouldn't just talk to me about art. They'd tell me, you know, you should read Ginsberg, and they'd bring one in, you know. When the younger one had smoked pot and hash, and he was sort of encouraging me to check out the beatniks. And so I was lucky through a mixture of my own stubbornness and a perverse liberalism in this really straight school. Lapped up Dada and surrealism, especially Dada. I just thought it was so great. Because it was philosophy, and it was sociology, and it was action on the street, and it was challenge, and it was mischievous, and it was reckless. People died, you know. I thought that was pretty good. And they took drugs and did performances, and everything was fair game to become part of art, and everything that art was fair game to become part of life, and I never lost it. That's it. I still agree, you know. And then I did the first ever magazine cover for the school that wasn't just the school badge, the school symbol. I did a strange Greek god with big tits. Then they let it through. I got away with it. You know, after 400 and something years, I changed the design of all the school graphics. And then I started my own magazine, and would get people to write things about what they didn't like about the school. And then I started doing events in the school that were the nearest I could get to an acid test without the acid. I was doing pamphlets, political pamphlets for the right-wing group, the Monday Club. Then the next week I'd write the anarchist club Reply. I'd write both the pamphlets, and I didn't actually tell them they were all employing me as the pamphleteer. So I'd draw cartoons attacking the one I did the week before, and then another one the next week attacking that, you know. And then I'd write the whole article in the student newspaper saying this person should be thrown out of the university, and it was me. But I'd write under a false name. So I just tried to exacerbate every possible sore there was, for the sake of it, really, because I was bored. And of course, at university, I soon met the people who had drugs. Within 24 hours.
What were you studying there?
Sociology, psychology, and philosophy. I started to experiment with political actions that were more art-like because of my reading of Dada and so on. I decided that it didn't just have to be shouting, you know, racist pig and whatever, you know. What? That there might be more imaginative ways to do it, like painting the whole university pink one night without anyone knowing, so that everyone just came into the university and it was pink. And you didn't explain why, you just thought, let's just screw with their perceptions, let's just make them wonder, why the hell is it pink today? You know? And it actually created a lot more problems for the authorities, doing things that way around. So I started just playing with, you know, reversal of expectation, I guess.
Did you find the press?
And we got press interest.
On more too?
Yes, of course. It was very interesting to see how the media fell for bumper stickers, and that to have a couple of good basic phrases was just thought that they were lazy. That you could write the article for them if you just planned it right, and you could make sure you knew what they'd take a photo of. You know, so yeah, I learned a lot in a year. In a year there, we put a pig up to become the president of the union, but we decided to have everyone try and be president of the Students' Union as a joke. And what happened was we discovered that proportional representation does not work after a certain number of candidates. So the European Parliament came to interview us all because we discovered a flaw in the way that the Dutch Parliament was elected and so on, that we'd actually found out how to subvert European democracy by this art joke. And there was a big parliamentary and European parliamentary investigation, and I was, interrogated by all these big electoral experts on how had we managed to screw up the system so well. And we did end up with the office empty, and the seat in the office, and a thing on the desk saying President of the Students' Union, and anyone who wanted to go in there and sit there and answer the phone and say what they liked. We actually managed to do it. We had a conceptual president. Yeah, I started thinking of and using the word towards the end of that year. I started having visions, in a nutshell, strangely enough, much to my own surprise.
Feel like going into that at all, or?
It was very odd. I went home to see my parents one weekend. I was kind of in transit to London. Mm-hmm. And they said, oh, why don't we go and see a castle or something like that? I went, okay, and I sat in the back of the car, a bit bored, and started to drift, and was looking out of the window at the hedge going by and trying to have a drug experience because I didn't have anything with me. You know, it's like, if I blur my eyes a bit. And I guess it's a bit like the Brian Geisen story of flicker. I got some kind of flicker effect of some type, because all of a sudden I had an out-of-body experience, and I was in the hedge, and I was reduced to molecules so that I could travel through matter, and I was hearing voices, and I remember, this is really strange, but I like it, and it was very vivid, and there were all these ideas and proposals and strategies, and as soon as I didn't speak a word to my parents because I didn't want to forget what I'd experienced. And as soon as I got back, I ran upstairs and I just wrote it all down. I still got the notebooks. Wrote about 100 pages of notes. And that was the real solidification of the Come project.
So what?
But I was already a member of the Exploding Galaxy at that point. That was where I was on the way to. What happened was, while I was in university and becoming more active, creating these kind of Dada political events, and also real acid tests. I was doing lots of happenings, I guess more in a happenings vein. The Exploding Galaxy came up from London, and they asked around, and they said, is there anyone here? We've just had a split in the ranks, we're short of people, who might want to help? And everyone just said, oh, Genesis, he'll help, he'll do anything. So they came and found me. Huh?
They were a collective?
They grew out of David Medalla, who was a kinetic artist from the Philippines, who did bubble sculptures. And so they were from the kinetic art movement originally. But then they wanted to make kinetic art into a thing on the street, something bigger than just gallery art. Mm-hmm. So they set up a commune in Balls Pond Road, and they had poets and writers and filmmakers. Derek Jarman was part of it. That's how I met Derek. Tightrope walkers, art critics, beatniks, And they did street happenings.
What?
And they called them kinetic operas, but they were basically outdoor happenings. And they were the first people really doing that in London. And they got arrested a lot. And eventually the commune got busted. I spent 6 months with what was the Exploding Galaxy and was renamed Transmedia Exploration. And I still use that word, of course.
And what kind of work were you guys doing at that time?
Very improvised, surreal happenings, I guess. But it was very rigorous. It was like a boot camp for deprogramming. You could not sleep in the same place 2 days running. There were no beds. The walls were knocked out so that if you were in the toilet, you were in the same room as everyone who was eating. If you were having a bath, you were in the same room as everybody. If you were trying to have sex, everyone was in one big space all the time, whatever process they were involved in. You never went to sleep at the same time every day. Every possible habit was broken. You couldn't eat the same thing you ate before. You couldn't have your hair the same the next day. All the clothes were in one box, male and female, and you just took whatever came out and wore. So you had to invent a character every day based on what you got from the box.
And that was for 6 months you were with them?
Yeah.
That's intense.
And it was really 24 hours a day.
Cultural boot camp.
Absolutely. And I blessed the day I went there. It was so fantastic. And you had, everyone had the equal right. You'd be wandering around and somebody would say, why did you open that book and read it? And you go, what do you mean? And they'd say, well, you've read English before, haven't you? Yes. Well, then why are you reading it again? Why does it have to be a book? Why does it have to be that shape? Why does it have to be on paper? Why do the words have to use the same alphabet? And you'd have to come up with reasons, and if you couldn't, you'd have to find another way to have something that might or might not be read, but that could communicate an idea that wasn't just flat, square, round, whatever it might be. And once you'd invented it, everyone would say, well, didn't you do that yesterday? You know, or they would take it and run with it and change it again. So it was kinetic in that sense. It was hyperkinetic, you know, and it was basically all about the destruction of every possible expectation and habit. It was very intense, and I've seen people become catatonic and have breakdowns while they were there. I mean, seriously, you know, very quickly too.
So it was really reactive.
Yes, it was very tough, and most people couldn't take it. I loved it. I thrived. You know, it was exactly what I hoped was going on somewhere. You know,
So
to be permanently challenged and have everything destroyed and have nothing to hold on to was my dream. You know, that didn't scare me at all. That was what I was aspiring to have nothing. You know, and to wake up, to be able to wake up fresh, to be able to wake up and not just, you know, work based on an imposed, inherited concept. One of the things that I still use is the deconstructed alphabet, where we were working on making a typewriter that changed the way it typed each time you used it. So we broke down the alphabet. We discovered if you use the alphabet, the English alphabet, in capital letters, you could reduce it down to just lines, sloped lines, horizontal lines, and vertical lines, and curves. And that therefore you would only need a few keys that had the same curves for the S, the B, the same curves, you know, and for an O and a P, all the same curves. All the B, the P, the Q is the same as the O. It's two semicircles. And E is 3 horizontals. A T has the top horizontal, an H has the middle horizontal, and L has the bottom horizontal. So there's very few things making up those capital letters, and you can join them and make words. But you can also make the words go any direction you want now, because you don't have to be linear, and you can drop away some based on whim and intuition as long. So it just became very free fall, and I was actually assigned to that was one of my main tests, was the deconstruction of language. And I still use that way of writing on collages and sigils and graphics and paintings. To this day, I can't help it. I can write almost as fast that way as I can any other way. And I can read it years later. I can go back and I can repiece it together. And I actually invented 3 other versions of it too that are more difficult to read, where you take everything vertically and everything horizontally and drop one lot. All the horizontals drop down a line, but they're still attached at the bottom, so it becomes like this. Strange Arabic-looking things. No drugs, no salt, no alcohol, no cigarettes, no meat. Very, very macrobiotic.
That's even more interesting.
The classic Animal Farm thing happened, of course, which was that the guy, Gerald Fitzgerald, who was in charge, became in charge, and was more of the guru figure for a lot of the people. And his girlfriend, or the girl who became his girlfriend from the people involved, suddenly decided it was okay for them to have a bed and be in the same bedroom all the time. And then one day she turned up and she had handmade Victorian boots, you know, and I was kind of curious how she did that when none of us had money. Any money you got was put in a box too, and if you wanted to spend even 20 cents, you had to explain to everybody why. And they would say, they would all come up with other ways you could do it that didn't need the 20 cents. Like you could walk for 2 days, you know, instead of getting the bus, or et cetera, et cetera. So there was no way she could have done it within the parameters of the group. And of course she'd just taken money from the box and got boots, and she was protected because she was his girlfriend. He wouldn't actually confront the fact that this was inappropriate. And of course, me being a big mouth and a fanatic by nature, immediately started waging war on them both, you know, and I became the champion of the ultra motive, you know. I suddenly was the purist who felt that they'd betrayed the idea, and I would just rant, I would do all this stuff back, you see. How come you're doing this? And in the end, she freaked out and chased me with a big pair of sewing scissors. She was really, she'd really lost it. She was genuinely violent, and I couldn't help but just giggle. Which made it worse, of course. I was just laughing and giggling and diving out of the way when she lunged for me. And eventually we made our way up. I left the next day. It caused too much friction. Well, that was another reason I had friction with transmedia, was that it was all kinetic, but there was no sound. And I thought, well, it's non-sexual and it's hierarchical and it's got no music. I think that should definitely be involved. So I went off to do my new improved version, and even had a rubber stamp for postal mail art that said new improved coon for a while, you know. But that doesn't take away from what I learned in terms of pulling potential from people and exploiting changing character and the dematerialization of identity and so on. Well, I after the Ho Ho Funhouse, I got frustrated with the yuppie side of the hippies. And so while they were all at the Isle of Wight festival with Bob Dylan, I moved in the Hells Angels chapter that was local for a big weekend party. I was the only one who wouldn't go to the festival. I had this fantastic, huge, long weekend with the Hells Angels that was really nuts. And of course they demolished everyone else's rooms because they were out of control. So everyone came back and their rooms were trashed. And I was responsible, and they held me responsible, and they all moved out, saying I was a terrible person, and I wasn't a real hippie, and how could I have met these people? You know, where did I meet such revolting people and low-class scum as the Hells Angels? So I held on to that building for a while, and it became the Hells Angels Clubhouse, and I was the caretaker for about 3 or 4 months, and then I found another big, old, rambling, derelict house around the corner that I took over. And I started what I guess was another psychotherapeutic art community there.
Called?
Well, that was the Coombe Transmissions. And I took the whole box thing further. I had a room called the Costume Room, and in that room were lots of costumes based on characters, like archetypal characters. The straight-laced housewife, Harriet Straight-Lace, and they were in entire costume with accessories and everything and makeup and so on, and they were all organised to certain key characters, but then there were lots of other things you could also improvise with, and it was huge. It was as big as this space here. It's just this.
The drugs and music were part of this.
Yeah, they did return. They did indeed return. Yes. LSD in particular did return with a vengeance, and I'm jolly glad too. So every weekend, people we'd met in the town, some of them were school kids and some of them were on the dole.
This is in Yorkshire.
Yeah. Somehow they'd see things happening in the street and come up and talk, and you could just feel which ones were interested and say, hey, come round, have a cup of tea, you know, join in. And so it just became this sprawling, expanding street theatre happening to the world outside. That's what it was. But it was also deeper because, again, you could go in the costume room and you would emerge as Mr. Alien Brain, and you were an alien. And you had to talk as an alien and behave as an alien and be an alien all day. And go shopping as an alien and go and sign on the dole as an alien and be arrested as an alien, whatever. Or you would be Harriet Straight-Lace, the housewife, and you would be upset by everything, including everyone. It's terrible, it's terrible. And you'd have to get into character. So it was a series of characters, and you had to try and live the characters. And even have positions about life that you didn't agree with. And be convincing. And that was good.
Okay,
so we would basically, every room began to be decorated. Like if you walked inside, all baby prams were all along the roofs. It was very much like the descriptions I've read of Dada and Surrealist events where they would hang coal in sacks on the roof and so on. I was still influenced by that. So it was totally an alien environment, very baroque. And the whole building was an installation. And we were the characters in it, so it was a constant 24-hour surreal play happening. And there were speakers hidden everywhere in the ceilings and the walls and behind things, and microphones and so on, so that people in the street would hear people talking to them and wouldn't know where it was coming from. And when you came inside, you know, there were loop tapes going, and we had friends who were professional burglars, and they would just keep bringing more and more tape recorders and microphones and amplifiers until the whole place was bugged. You know, it was nuts, and of course it drew a lot of attention, unfortunately, from the police too. But so one day this guy came up in a suit and said, "I'm from the local arts centre, you know, and I really like what you people are doing." I mean, and we said, "Well, that's nice, yeah, great." And he said, "You should do something at the arts centre." And we said, "Yeah, right." And he said, "We'll pay you." And we went, "Yeah, right." He said, "You know, you can get grants for doing this kind of thing." And we said, "We can." And he said, "Yes, it's performance art." We said, "It's what?" He said, "It's performance art." We said, "Okay, it's performance art. Where do we get the grant?" And he said, "You know, come and do a thing, an evening." So we did the Alien Brain at the Hull Arts Centre, and it was a big success. The local newspapers lapped it all up because it was crazy. And then he gave us all these forms to fill in, and I filled them in and sent them off, and we got money. We were good at doing that. We were good at talking to local people and making them decide we weren't so bad after all, and getting them to donate things. And sometimes once we got given a ton of gas masks. You know, they said, you know, somebody went, "Do you want a ton of gas masks?" And we said, "Yeah, sure, okay." So we filled a room with gas masks, which was fun anyway, and then we started to spray them gold, because we got given gold spray paint by somebody else. So in the end we had a ton of gold gas masks. So we would just build environments. So basically we'd build an incredible environment with whatever materials we had at the time, and then we would be the characters in the environment, and we would improvise. And we would provoke people in the audience, and we would just make sounds. We'd wire the place up, so we'd recreate the house. Sometimes we'd take everything in a room in the house and move it there and rebuild the room somewhere, like the living room. So we'd all be sat in armchairs, and we'd just have cups of tea and talk like we did anyway, and they rented us for a day as we were at home. We built once we just built a minefield at this arts event in this park, and put loads and loads and loads and loads of barbed wire, like a First World War warfield. But it was real mines. We'd make these, they would explode. There were tripwires and everything. And we put up lots and lots of warnings and gave out leaflets. "This is a real minefield. It's really dangerous. Don't go in. Don't touch anything. It will explode." And of course, the drunken 20-year-olds wanted to show off to their girlfriends, and they'd jump over the barbed wire and fall over and hit a tripwire, and there'd be a big explosion, and they'd just about piss their pants and start complaining about the fact there was a minefield in the arts festival. You know? A File magazine somehow as well, and so I'd write to lots more people from File, and I was writing to Robin Klasnick and Jules Baker, and I would also meet them at some of these festivals, and they were all living in a licensed squat in a big factory in Hackney, in Martello Street. And so when they'd already said, "Why don't you just come to London? You know, why are you banging your head on a brick wall in this nutty town? You know, it's bound to get bad." And so I said, "Okay." So I drove down there, basically. And I said, "Is there anywhere in the factory that I could put my stuff?" And there was one part of the basement that was rotten. There was no floor, there was no electricity, no water. It was just a gutted piece of the basement of a factory. And I said, "I'll have it." I drove around in the truck, and I went in derelict buildings and went to building sites where they're demolishing stuff, and just said, you know, I work for a children's project for challenged, physically handicapped children, and we're doing a theatre piece, and we really need floorboards. And scrounged enough stuff to put a floor in, and then found somebody who did electrics, you know, I don't know, just renovated it. Put in water, put in electricity, put in a floor, and moved in there. And Bruce Lacey was there, who did robotics, and Andrew Logan did the alternative Miss World events at this factory. Hermine, who was part of the Exploding Galaxy, the tightrope walker, she used to practice there. So I knew all the people, a lot of performance art people.
Doing at that point was already approaching something very confrontational, violent, sexual.
Yes, that was coming more and more, and once we shed everyone in Hull and we were on our own, it just that was amplified really quickly. You know, when it was the male-female characters, the archetypes, it was inevitable that the sexual roles and the gender roles would become more intrinsic, I think. And my interest was in the man and the woman as archetypes, and as being both. That I could be the woman and she could be the man, and that we were shadow creatures of each other, and we weren't representing her and me or him and her, but we were actually one person. And if I could have been two bodies, that would have been even better, you know. What I wanted to explore was a hermaphroditic aspect of being, and what sort of resonance happened when you started to give full recognition, physical recognition to this whole other being inside you, and also what was in between, and what were all the gradations, and what were the dynamics when the society in the early 70s was confronted with that, and it was actually pro-sexual. And I guess some of that came from, I mean, all these things are synthetic. I was in the Gay-Live Street Theatre, so I'd already been with people who were transvestites as a political act, and even had a lover who was for a while. So it didn't come from nowhere. It all gets mulled over, and all these little things turn and interrelate and trigger each other. And I think, you know, what I learned from the 6-month boot camp was how to be fluid and flexible, and how to let things through and not have any preconceptions in advance of what might be happening to me next. That my identity was never fixed, should never be fixed, and didn't even really belong to me. And so it was a really deep exploration, you know, beyond habit, beyond just conditioning. It was into the DNA, if you like. Well, we started to do more and more performances, just myself and Cozy, that were very, very, very overtly sexually based, dealing with taboos, dealing with transgressions, dealing with sexual programming. So they did include masturbation and making love and having mutual anal sex and having sex with strange objects, and all at really, really slowed down speed. And they got more and more aesthetic and graphic, both in terms of how they looked as well as what was the content. And we discovered, surprisingly, that serious galleries and art critics became more and more curious and supportive the more and more we pushed ourselves.
Wow.
Which we didn't expect at all. I mean, we didn't really have an expectation. We were pushing ourselves at home as well as in public. What we did in public was always just a bit of what we were doing anyway, you know. And through doing things in the galleries, in the Museum of Modern Art in Paris and Brussels and all over, for a while everything became completely silent, surprisingly. And we would take 8 hours to just cross a room, but during that crossing the room, all kinds of things would have happened that, if you freeze-frame them, were quite surprising or erotic or disturbing. And yet all that had happened in terms of a script was we crossed the room and took no notice of each other. That might be the only directive we had, you know. But on the way across, we would have used blood, urine, milk, all kinds of things would have gone on, and we would be transformed by the time we got to the other side. But you couldn't say when it happened. It was so slow that time was changed a lot. And that was very effective for a long time, making it more and more slow and silent. But then there was a point when we had complete control over what happened. We knew we could be convincing. We knew we could make it so gripping that people would remain silent. And we knew that we were getting a favorable response, which meant we didn't need to do it anymore. Well, in 75, Sleazy appeared as well.
Okay, and now he was working with hypnosis.
He was working with hypnosis, doing all those surreal photograph record covers and so on.
Right.
And he was fascinated with Burroughs, and the only reason, really, apart from probably an innate curiosity of seeing us and thinking that we were doing something no one else was, that he knew of anyway, that he really spoke to me the first time was because he wanted to find out William Burroughs' address. Because he wanted to send him some of his photos of boys. And I said, sure, come round, come and visit. Show me the photos too. I'd love to see your pictures of young boys with injuries. Sounds really interesting, which led towards TG happened. I think that gave it a push, and also his interest in simulating injuries, so that we could have real injuries and phony injuries, and people would be aghast at the phony ones and not notice the real ones. We could play with all these extra realities suddenly. Well, in 1975, I decided that we should move into the world of popular music.
What spurred that on?
I talked to William Burroughs. One of my conversations with William Burroughs, and we'd basically proved our point. People with no official art training and no art sponsorship or patronage at the beginning, and not in a gallery system, had become, certainly in Europe, accepted as important artists, and on a par with Gilbert and George, who we often did things at the same events, you know, and I got on well with Gilbert and George. So suddenly we were doing big retrospectives of, you know, modern contemporary British art. We'd done it. We were in catalogues. We were in art magazines. We were getting bursaries. We were paid per annum just to be performance artists, whatever we did. And that you could infiltrate all kinds of big target cultural institutions and actually do something unexpected and make it work.
And confront the status quo.
Yeah.
At the same time.
So Burroughs basically said, well, that's all fine, you know, and it's great, and he'd help me get grants, so he wasn't antagonistic to Kuhn, but he said, but if you went into the local pub in Hackney, would they understand what you were doing? We actually began, I'd already had the name Throbbing Gristle since we were in Hull. It was slang, so it was always going to...
Slang for?
An erect penis, having an orgasm, I guess. And all the local prostitutes used to have sex against the wall opposite the house where we were, you see, so we'd turn off all the lights and take acid and watch them on a Friday night. That's one of our entertainments. And they'd use all these very colourful expressions, and lots of those got absorbed into the Throbbing Gristle project, including the name of the band. And I wanted it to have a name that was completely ugly and awkward and not like the name of somebody doing serious art-based music.
No.
I wanted everything to be contradictory and unexpected.
What was art-based music in London?
Well, I think it was, well, what we were doing was going to be art-based just because we were conceiving of it from Kuhn. So we were looking at it and perceiving it and strategizing it very clearly. We worked out about having uniforms. We worked out about the graphics and what they would be like, the slogans, the attitudes, the press releases. We spent that whole year of 75, every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we would meet and build equipment and then find out what that equipment could do and then rebuild it. We built all our own speakers. And it was during that year that we met Chris Carter. He was friends with Bruce Lacey's son, Bruce Lacey being the robotics person upstairs who was the caretaker of the building. And Bruce Lacey's son said, oh, I know a guy who can build things called Chris. And so I said, well, bring him down, you know. So the next weekend down came Chris, and it turned out he built analog synths as a hobby and built effects and built speakers and understood all that stuff and was a studio engineer somewhere in a television company. So it was the, okay, you turned up at the right time, welcome to the band. He bought lots of bugging devices, and he used to bug boy prostitutes' rooms and things and make tapes of boy prostitutes propositioning clients and use those. And so a lot of the stuff is authentic and illegal. He also bugged a mercenary office as well, where they recruited mercenaries for Rhodesia. That was very dangerous. We bugged them from a car outside. So one of the things we wanted to do was to bring in this whole truly, you know, investigative journalistic approach to music.
What do you think about the explosion of punk at that time as opposed to what you were trying to do?
Well, it was careerist. They wanted a career. They wanted to be popular. They wanted groupies. They wanted to be in magazines. It was the same story as Cliff Richard and Elvis and everyone else, you know. Success and attention was more important than integrity. I wasn't interested. It was obvious. It was like such an obvious unfolding that was going to happen. it wasn't exciting for me. The only thing that was exciting was the occasional accidental unleashing of mindless violence.
So how did you guys collide with this world? And what
John Craveen. You see, John Craveen, who was at university with me, lived in the Ho-Ho Funhouse and helped finance that. Drove an old London taxi with Smile, and that was the taxi that took us out to the country to take drugs. He let me live in his flat on the floor when I went back to do the Coombe thing more. I bumped into him in Portobello Road. I was walking along and he ran out of this lock-up shop and said, "Genesis." And I went, "John?" And I said, "What are you doing now?" He said, "Oh, I have a clothing shop." I went, "You've got what?" Don was already starting his punk movie. And I discovered there was this thing between Sex, which was Malcolm McLaren, and what became Boy, which was John Craveen. And John said, "Oh, I'm starting a punk band to sell the clothes in my shop like Malcolm's got his band. And I don't know anything about music. Will you audition everyone?" That's how I got to meet them all. So I did. I auditioned people for his band, Chelsea. And I picked out Billy Idol, who was still Bill Broad, and Tony James, who went on to do Zig Zig Sputnik, and John Towie, who went on in lots of groups as a drummer, and Gene October was already in it. John Craveen had found Gene October, so I picked the others. And the Damned rehearsed in the place where the auditions were, so I met them. I liked Dave Vanian immediately. I thought he was funny. So I just met them, and then through them I met Mark Perry, who did Sniffing Glue, who was already formed a band with Alex Ferguson, who was Alternative TV. And through them I met Sue Catwoman, who was Mark P's girlfriend, who was the Sex Pistols girl, on the front of the first Anarchy in the UK magazine. And she ended up in the hospital ill, and he didn't bother to go and see her, so I went to see her, and she ended up being my lover, and she knew everyone. So she'd take me out, and she'd dress as a Marine, and I'd dress as a Marine. And I met everyone. She just knew everyone in every band. So I was just, all of a sudden, I knew them all, the Jam and everyone, when they were just playing in little pubs.
Were you already working as Robin Gristle?
Yes, that's why Mark Perry was interested. He'd heard that we were doing a really much more extreme anti-music project, and he was really into it.
So what were the first shows of
Well,
Gristle like?
it got to 76, and before Prostitution, we got to the point where we'd learned how to make enough strange noises and make the equipment almost play itself and become a noise environment. And we would just touch things and hit things, guitars and that, and it would just change and pulse, and I would improvise stories and ideas and words over it. And I was asked to curate an exhibition at the Air Gallery in London. And so I was already into the idea that people who create interesting radical art, their psychological profile is probably the same as the interesting criminals. Not a new thought. Colin Wilson's written about it, but I'd taken it on board, and I thought it was an interesting way of looking at art, that they were all criminals, and that the best artists had to be the ones most like criminals, and the others were petty criminals. So I was kind of having a nice time, making different value judgments as to the value, what art was worthwhile or not, based on the antisocial attitudes of the creator rather than the product. And so I did this exhibition based on that. It was called High Crime is the Same as High Art. And several people that I picked to be in it wouldn't be in it because of the title. And there was a big stink because the poster was done like a newspaper thing, so it looked like it was a newspaper headline and that someone had done something bad, and it was really bland, the poster. It really upset everyone in the art world. And they'd originally said they wanted Coombe to do something too, so we said, okay, we're doing a project called Throbbing Gristle. They didn't know what that was. And we set up all our stuff in the back room, which had big, thick concrete walls, locked the doors, and then played for an hour with the doors locked so no one could come in. So they could only hear it through the wall, through the concrete wall. Because we were still in a real purist phase of it being industrial and it being the building as well. And that was the very first public one. And then we'd been booked to do an outdoor festival, Winchester, a town called Winchester. And we rang them up and said, we don't do Coombe anymore, we actually do Throbbing Gristle now, but we'd do that for you if you want. So they rented a hall somewhere, and we did one there too. So we did two kind of tryout TG things before the ICA. And then the ICA was a retrospective of Coombe Transmissions, but it was also the unveiling, the spectacle unveiling of Throbbing Gristle, and saying, that's the past, this is what we're doing now.
How that manifests?
We had two striptease dancers, and somebody told me about, and I think it might have been Derek Jarman, told me about these people who were transvestite security guards, and they were all over 6'2". So we hired them as the security. So we had all these really, really tall transvestites as the security for the whole gallery, and a bar selling.
Demi-monde must have flipped.
And of course, because of John Craveen and Sue Catwoman and everyone, all the punks, the proto-punks, who hadn't really been seen yet, although they were around, they hadn't hit the mass media at that point. They all came too.
This must have been very hardy for them.
Well, they liked Throbbing Gristle, although they thought Throbbing Gristle were far too gratuitous and violent. They thought we were well out of control, and it turned out afterwards that Sue Catwoman came, Susie and the Banshees, as would be, though they weren't yet, they came, and they said later that they were warned that I was supposedly going to hang myself with cheese wire during the performance, and that's why they stayed further back. So there were all these rumours going around amongst the punks because they thought we were completely nutty. They thought we were really insane.
What sort of things did you
And we didn't play real music. That was the other thing they hated about it. So it was the very first time that Britain and London saw all of those emerging dynamics and movements simultaneously, all in one night.
What stuff were you doing on stage? I mean, at that time, people thought would be violent.
Well, we were still including some of the performance things. So, like Chris Carter would be playing a synth, but gradually wrapping barbed wire around his arms so that the arms would sort of start bleeding, and in the end his synth would all get covered in blood. But he'd be expressionless while he did it, And Cozy would have a leather jacket on, but nothing underneath, and she had simulated wounds, so it looked like she had great big gashes in her breasts and her stomach, and then I would drink milk and urine and blood in advance so that I could vomit blood and urine over people whenever I wanted to. Which all sounds corny now, but really no one else was doing. Even the punk bands who were just starting hadn't even come up with being that obnoxious.
You were puking.
I puked over Susie. Ruined her clothes. She's never forgotten, although she's forgiven.
What about appropriation generally?
Well, at that time we were basically using all these. We were using surveillance tapes and espionage techniques. We were really interested in that paramilitary, covert way of working, and then using those tapes in a Burroughsian way, which with trouble tapes, sex tapes. Yeah, one of the things I read about in The Third Mind and some of the other little essays that Burroughs and Geisin wrote about their experiments with tape recordings, which luckily I could check because I was friends with them, was this idea of, he tried it at the Chicago riots, Burroughs, walking around with a simple condenser mic tape recorder and recording the sounds of what's going on, going away, cutting in trouble tapes, which is police sirens, guns, people screaming, anything to do with panic and trouble, cops shouting stop, anything like. You cut those in to the environment, which is the sound you've recorded, the standard environment. You go back, you walk around again, but you're playing the trouble tapes cut in. And his contention was that it's a magical ritual, and what you will do is you will manifest the trouble.
And he tried that?
Oh, he's done that lots, and Geisin too, and in fact he even claims to have closed down a restaurant that gave him bad food by doing that. In London.
Did magic and ritual become part of the goings-on?
Well, I was interested in it in a kind of empirical research way. I wanted to check out whether it happened, and if it happened, when it happened, and if we could repeat it if it happened. So it was scientific at the beginning, although I was aware it was a magical act. As time progressed, that was when I switched into psychic TV and started to look at it as purely a magical thing, assembling sound and music.
Let's go back.
But you know, I was just giving you an aside there to give you an idea of why we would choose those kinds of sounds. There were no samplers. Trouble tapes, erotic tapes were the favourites, and things to do with autopsies and death. You know. Basic human archetypal fears and shame and guilt trips were what we were interested in. War. Murder, war, sex, drugs. Not so many drugs actually, but and trouble. You know, we were anarchists. It was an anarchist project. You know, we wanted to subvert and degrade and devalue all the sacred aspects of popular music, the history of rock and roll. We had no respect for it. We didn't think it deserved respect. We thought it should be flushed down the toilet with a lot of other art and music. And if we could accelerate that process and reveal the vacuousness and reveal the contradictions and reveal other ways of approaching the dynamic of someone making sound, someone being theoretically an audience.
Was it a revolutionary act?
I don't care.
I mean,
I'm a hedonist. I don't care if it's revolutionary.
I mean, do you feel like...
I'm a nihilist and a hedonist and a sensualist. As to being a revolutionary, that's society's business. Isolate authority, isolate control, isolate the system they use to maintain people's stupidity and sleepiness, and reveal it and then despise it vocally, and describe it and subvert it and challenge it and confront it and stare into its eyes and then turn away and do something else because it's assimilated at that point. It's always going to be a small doorway, and you always have to close the door either by going through or walking away. But, you know, don't stay in the doorway for 20 years repeating yourself. It means change. Change whether it destroys what you did before or not. Change whether you can pay the rent or not. Change whether you're going insane or not. Change whether you don't know what the hell you're doing it for anymore or not. Just keep changing. Destroy everything that went before and keep changing. And when you become habituated, be scared and change again. Chris and Sleazy found these headphones with the little microphones that were actually from a surveillance shop before you could buy them. Now they're everywhere, but this was before you could buy them except through spy espionage shops. And they converted them with switches, so on stage they could all talk to each other through them without the audience hearing, and then they could flick a switch and anything they said would come out of the PA as well. So that normally we felt people would move away to a point where they could control what was happening to them. As they moved away, it got louder because it was behind. So there was this whole maintaining control over... We insisted on absolute control over how much we abused the audience. You know, it was very important to us that we had... If we decided we wanted to find out what happened to them when we did this to them, we didn't want them to have a way to stop us finding out. A sensory deprivation experience, or as some kind of challenge that they had to go through, physical, emotional, mental challenge that they had to survive.
What were your motives?
Same, you know, the same. Find out what happens when you push yourself over the edge. Find out what's unknown, you know, see what happens to us. I mean, we always experimented on ourselves too. At the Death Factory, in the old factory, we'd put everything on as loud as we could, and we would stand in front of the speakers for 2 or 3 hours and see what happened to us, whether we felt sick, whether we fell over. And sometimes we were very affected, you know. We got tunnel vision. Chris went temporarily blind from the frequencies. We did, I guess the staging is the first thing to think of. We did one at the Architectural Association where we were asked to, I guess we were asked to play at the end of term party or something. I'm not quite sure now, but we ended up there, and we set up inside with video surveillance cameras inside, black and white ones, one for each person. And then when we played, we locked the door, so there was no audience actually able to get to what was theoretically the stage. And we had TV monitors in the building, in all the corridors and the ordinary rooms where we would normally play, with no sound, no audio feed. So you could either watch us and not hear anything, or you could go and hang out of a window or stand on the roof and hear it, but not see anything. There was a riot. there was a really violent riot. People started smashing down the door. They pulled toilets out of toilet closets and threw entire toilets down. Luckily, we'd built it well, and it just these things just bounced off the top of this box and flew off. And we did another one at the film co-op where we just had the film screen in front of us and we showed our movie and played live to the movie, but no one could see us. And there was another violent reaction. Members of the Slits started throwing chairs, screaming that it was unfair they couldn't see us, that it was sexist because they couldn't see us. And we did the classic. We found scrunching. We found all these big mylar mirrors from some shop displays. Another time, we just had a huge mirror in front of us, so all they could see was themselves. And we shone halogen lamps on them too, so they could see themselves really well. Some of it was just pure perversity and just spite, to be honest. Sometimes it was just spite, or it was just triggered by finding the mirrors, you know. It wasn't necessarily, oh, this is symbolic of this. It was more, fuck them, let's stick mirrors up, you know, then we don't have to worry about them. It's kind of more we just didn't like the audience. We didn't like to have to deal with them. We didn't really particularly care what they thought. They were our guinea pigs.
Were you familiar?
We were very callous. It was very callous. We didn't care. We didn't care if they vomited. We didn't care if they tried to leave the room. We didn't care if it was uncomfortable, and we didn't care if they loved it, you know. We really wanted to be in a more visceral, gratuitous, and meaningless form of culture. We liked that. It was relaxing for us. If you like, it almost worked as a flagship for a movement, a loose movement. It spoke very loudly and symbolically and graphically. But we did nothing else. We lived and breathed and died it 24 hours a day and risked everything for it. And I'm staggered how much energy we must have put into doing all that stuff. You know, just the sheer physical, mental energy involved. We were possessed, if you like. Maybe that's part of the whole process, to be possessed. And all the other disciplines about never returning to the previous character and always breaking habits, those are really all tools to maintain the space in the greater person and the greater intellectual activity of any individual, so that you can be possessed. Everything I've done that I'm proud of is in a moment of trance, if you like, in a moment of being possessed. It's not me per se, it's something coming through me, it's mediumistic. And those are always the evenings that are the best ones, the performances that are the best ones. They're always when time stops, you know.